Let the glory of the Lord endure forever.
Let the glory of the Lord endure forever.
Let the Lord be glad in His works.
Let the Lord be glad in His.
They put this down here because I'm short. There, that's better. Feels good. Some of you remember Damien Kyle. You know, when I go to his church. So that's one of the reasons why I try not to stand behind pulpits, although there are other reasons. You know, it's more than the fact that I move around a lot. It's a philosophical thing with me, because I view the pulpit, when I go into a new place to speak, or in any place to speak, one of the first things I do is I look at the architectural barriers that are there. And there tend to be ones. Pews are barriers, whether you realize that or not. All of you past the first row have a barrier protecting you from me. And so I get up here, that's okay, I have my own barrier protecting me from you. And I don't like barriers. And so I figure, well, I can't get you out of the pew, but I can certainly get out from behind the pulpit. And when I move out from behind the pulpit in places where they've never seen anybody move out from behind the pulpit, immediately I have their attention. In fact, I was speaking at a really old Presbyterian church. I think it was 1,500 years old or something. Up in Canada, in, I guess, Cambridge, Ontario. And it was one of those places where they gave me a lapel mic, but it didn't matter because you couldn't move. To get out beside meant you had to be an acrobat, you know. But I acrobated. And the choir was right around below me, facing the crowd. And then they were all in this long, couldn't see the whites of their eyes building. And so I got up there and I figured, you know, I'm just going to be me. So I got started, and pretty soon the choir was breaking their necks to try to see what was going on. But I study architectural barriers because I like to overcome them. You have to understand that this kind of thing is not a product of the early church, not a product of the Scripture. It's just one of the cultural things that we have adopted through the years. And sometimes it's a problem, sometimes it's a blessing. And when it is a problem, I try to overcome it every way I can. Sometimes through the years, too, people have expected the preacher to be boring. I mean, what else is church supposed to be? Everywhere they go, it's boring, you know. In fact, I won't tell you what denomination this was, but it was in Finland, where I was speaking, which I did for several years in a row, to to a youth congress of about 10,000 young people. It was quite a big thing. And they brought me all the way over from the United States to speak, and I enjoyed it. But in addition to my speaking, they would have some of their own group that would speak at certain points. And I'd sit there and I'd think, you have to study to be that boring. Nobody can naturally be that boring. You've got to have in seminary how to bore in order to do that. You know? And I'll be honest with you, to me, the Bible is so exciting, it's a crime to make it boring. You know? And when I hear it that way, my wife and I, for our 30th wedding anniversary, we've now celebrated 42 of them. I celebrate at least. But for our 30th, we went to England and spent a week in England. On a Sunday, we were in Cambridge, England, and went to Christ Chapel in Cambridge University for Sunday. Now, this is a great big old thing. I thought it was a cathedral, but it isn't. They have, you know, things you have to go through And I guess that one hadn't gone through it yet to be a cathedral. But we went that morning, and maybe there were 110 people there, 100 of them being tourists, in this massive place. They had rows, I don't know how to describe it, that weren't facing us, and the preacher didn't face us. These two rows faced each other that included the choir. And one guy on this side gets up and reads the scripture. That's okay. And then he sits down and goes to sleep. It's true. And the preacher was on the other side. And so he takes the scripture, this other guy reads, and he starts teaching. Now, it took him 30 seconds to exhaust all he knew about the scripture. And from then on, he was drifting off into some sort of philosophical, sociological, theological... And I wanted to jump up, because it was good scripture, you know. And my wife had to hold me back, you know. Because I wanted to jump up and say, let me preach. This is good. And it just made me once again realize that he had to study to make it that bad. You can't naturally do that. And so the scripture is just so wonderful and alive, and you know that because simply by the straightforward teaching of it, it becomes alive in the hearts of people. And you know, people come to Calvary Chapels not because we're so nice, but because God honors His Word. You know, He takes former hippies and some who still are, and people who don't know one end from the other, and murder the King's English, and sound like they've never quite left Mexico. And God does wonderful things. Why? Because it's the Lord, see? And this is the beautiful thing. And that's why we will always confound and mystify people. I got to tell you another story. I don't think I've ever told this one here. But when I taught at a college in Southern California, a Christian college, one of the classes that I developed was called Ministering in Death and Dying. Now that's the kind of class that will always have, you know, students, because people are constantly dying. And it was one of my favorite classes. But one of the things that I hit upon was so amazing. The University of Washington, Gayle. The director of the Department of Medicine of their medical college contracted stomach cancer and asked them, he decided to have them or someone videotape or film the stages of his dying. They interviewed the people who were caregivers. They interviewed his family at different stages so you could see how they were dealing with it and so forth. They interviewed the doctors, and that was a really enlightening interview. The doctors sat there and were most candid I'd ever heard doctors. You know, for once they weren't trying to be gods. And the doctor said he was an impossible patient because he knew that we didn't know. Thought, well, now that's pretty candid. But they interviewed also the spiritual caregivers. Fascinating. They had their pastor, a man of great dignity, pastor of one of the more significant churches in town, graduate of numerous places of learning, well-dressed. And the other person they had was their gardener. Think I'm pretty dry, huh? The fascinating thing was their gardener had been the one who had led them to Jesus. He was just a kid who loved the Lord,